start off with going back to the very first clip, Trafficking Souls from 1913. And although on the face of that, there was probably nothing about government that came out, it actually marks a really interesting moment when the very first feature films, or photo plays as they were called, which were then being made in New York, it was before Hollywood, actually thought that they might be able to change things. This was the middle of the progressive, or the beginning of the progressive era, the age of reform, and this new mass medium came into being very suddenly, very quickly. And Trafficking Souls was one of the earliest films, and it was about the white slavery scare, the white slavery trade. There was a real mass hysteria between about 1910 and 1913 that was accepted pretty much throughout the nation. And it was about the fate of young girls, or young girls and young women who were being kidnapped off streets and kidnapped from farms and sold to brothels and sold into prostitution against their will. And there, and even before the film started, the movie started, there were a lot of literature, pamphlets and various kinds of books and all sorts of exposés. And 1913, the year that Trafficking Souls came out, also was the year that this first big report done by John D. Rockefeller Jr. came out on the white slavery trade and prostitution, and showed that in fact prostitution was rampant throughout the big cities and largely was supported by or made possible by police corruption and graft that ran all the way up to the highest levels of City Hall. So this film was, in a sense, a response to that. It was in the works before that report came out, but everyone knew these reports were coming out and that there was a lot to be said. The film, it's impossible to watch. I did try to watch it, and even historians who've watched it several times say it's still impossible to understand what's going on, but they kind of piece together bits of it. And it doesn't directly attack government, it doesn't directly attack the police, but by making it clear that the criminals, the villains, are people in high places, and that's how they're identified. There are a couple of title cards that say, the men in high places will now do such and such, and things like that. So it made very clear that this is a call for action, a call for reform, a call to the government to clean up this vice and clean up the corruption and try to save these, some people, including the New York Times, reported we're up to 50,000 women every year being kidnapped. The white slavery scare kind of faded very quickly as World War I came along and other things, but it was a reaction to immigration. The villains in white slavery stories and movies were almost always immigrants, often swarthy Southern Europeans or Jews. And the victims were always young women who had come to the city seeking a better life, but of course were totally unaware of how dangerous it was. And so they were kind of a response to the anxiety of this very changing world of urbanization. What's interesting is that within a couple of years, this idea that films might be able to act as a call to action and to spur government and to spur the forces of reform seems to have faded away very quickly. And even by 1920, nobody was making what were then called social problem films or social films. I mean, they really just seemed to disappear. There's a great quote by, from one of the early actresses in motion pictures. One second, I'll find it. Her name is Colleen Moore. She's in quite a few early pictures. Her quote was, "We were only interested in who was the president of Paramount, Universal, MGM, not who was president of the US." And that seems to have been the attitude that came across the film world even by 1920. So that in looking, I can't say I dug under every rock, but I really could find very few films from the 1920s that continued this idea of trying to spur some kind of social action or some kind of policy change. It erupted at the beginning of the film industry and then went away very, very quickly. And then I'm sure you've probably all heard the famous Samuel Goldwyn quote, and I don't know when he said this, and Goldwyn was later, but it might as well apply to the whole period. His quote was, "If you want to send a message, use Western Union." And that was what was generally perceived to be the attitude of Hollywood toward message movies. But there, of course, were always exceptions. And one of the, jumping ahead in the list there, one of the films that I thought was really interesting was Wilson, the one made in 1944, a biopic of Woodrow Wilson that was Darryl Zanuck's. He was one of the big Hollywood producers. It was his pet project. He spent $5 million on it, which was the most that anyone had spent on a Hollywood film up to that point, I believe. And it just lionized Wilson in the year that happened to be the year that FDR was running for a fourth term, or was deliberating whether to run for a fourth term. And so it was perceived as very much a pro-FDR film, to have a portrait of a president who was a great Democrat and a great war leader and a great internationalist and a great figure for world peace at the time when FDR was about to announce whether he would run again. It seems not to have been accidental. But it was interesting, the film critic James Agee, also the author of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, but he was a film critic for The Nation for about 10 years in that period and wrote some of the most perceptive reviews I've ever read. And what he said about this was quite funny. He said, it's a sincere and brave picture. It's aiming to be mature and serious. But in the end, he says that he hopes this won't become a Hollywood trend because the serious ideas never get discussed in any depth. And I'm paraphrasing this, but he likens it to Hollywood hopping on one foot trying to put on long pants. And says that what they end up with is basically a high-grade sort of magazine illustration. And I think that's true. You see that long speech by Wilson, which just seems to go on forever. And it does feel like, Agee's point was really that Hollywood movies aren't the place for these sorts of ideas, wonderful, deep ideas about sophisticated geopolitical issues are wonderful, but not in the movies. That's even what he was saying. I think Wilson was really sort of the last directly political call to arms or call to action about government that was, an explicit message film that I could come across. Then we saw a whole bunch of films that are implicitly about government, very much about personal responsibility of government and about how the government is only as good as the individual and all that sort of thing. And then, of course, these wonderful portraits like Magnificent Yankee or Mr. Smith, which is about a lot of other things too, that really hold up the one individual who seems to embody everything. The Cold War movies, Failsafe, the two clips there, I thought that was really interesting because it had Henry Fonda as the president making a call for kind of man at the top to actually face the reality of nuclear annihilation. And I remember Failsafe vaguely from, not right when it first came out, but soon afterwards. And I don't remember it being particularly controversial or anything, but I may not be remembering it right. When I look at it now, it seems incredibly ahead of its time. And really quite frightening movie. Easy Rider, so now we're up to 1969. A watershed movie both for the Hollywood industry and for ideas about government. It was the first time in any kind of Hollywood movie that the counterculture, the us and them dichotomy was presented. But I thought it was very funny that in that Jack Nicholson and Dennis Hopper campfire discussion, I mean, I don't know how recently, I know Larry saw it very recently, but there's a lot of campfire discussion. I've forgotten that part. A lot of talk around the campfire. In this one, it's funny that Jack Nicholson is evoking this kind of past ideal of America, which comes up over and over in films, that we were once a great country, we were once a great government, and something has gone wrong, we've lost it. And that seems to come up over and over again, but I'd forgotten that was one of the themes of Easy Rider. And then the post-Watergate period. I mean, I think once Watergate happened, there have been the films about the government, the US government, with few exceptions, tend to be mostly portraits of corruption, ineptitude, greed, criminality. I mean, it really just has carried on that way for the most part. Of course, there are exceptions. Ending up with, I thought Bulworth seemed like a good end, even though, you know, there have been some sins. And you might have heard there's a film just coming out with George Clooney called The Ides of March, which apparently is a fairly dark and cynical look at electoral politics. So that's really my very capsulated little survey of these things. I want to add that I totally agree with Larry that these films are reflections of where the country is. I think Hollywood is an amazing marketing machine. And they're very good at gauging the public mood. And it takes at least 6 months, usually a year or more, to get one of these films made. Definitely more than a year. So it's rare that they're over topical, and it's rare that they can address something that's really happening, but they do manage to tap into the zeitgeist in a way. They're very good at that, the ones that we hear about. There are, of course, a lot of films that never make it. We don't hear about it, but the ones that do, and I think they are a lot about what we want to see anyway, for various reasons. And that's not always the nicest view of government or the best attitudes toward who we are as a country or people, but it's often entertaining, and that's, of course, what they're after. Thank you.